welcome back to the third day of the EasyBuild user meeting. We're getting started in about 30 seconds. The first talk today is from JP Lehrer, who's going to give us who's a newbie to both Spack and EasyBuild, and he's going to compare the two for us and how he got on with starting off with them.
All right. So I guess that was the go.
Yeah, just about. My introduction was a little bit quick, so we'll just wait a couple more seconds and then go on the app.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
So I just make sure that I try to be caffeinated enough for the talk, and then all right. Yeah, so I guess it's right on the hour mark. So I start slowly and then pick up speed while we go. Yeah, so thank you for the introduction, and thanks for having me here. This all is an idea from Kenneth. So thank you for reaching out to me. And I'm presenting a noob test, Spec versus EasyBuild. And this title has, I guess, sparked some interest across, like the EUM channel, at least in the EasyBuild Slack. And if I have typos on my slides confusing Spec with Slack, I'm very sorry. I have been using these two words for a couple of times in the past 2 or 3 days. So sorry for that. Yeah. So my name is Jan Patrick, or JP Lehrer, and if you're active on Twitter, you can see what I post there using @JP Lehrer. Now, considering the Slack and Spec part, so Spec versus EasyBuild, and I was very happy taking screenshots yesterday evening with one thing that Kenneth I want to make crystal clear here. So he did not see my slides. So actually, nobody saw my slides because they also have not been around for too long. And then there's a vote who will win Spec or EasyBuild. So you can still bet or vote, and I'll vote after the talk. Now let me first look at a little bit of what is my background, because I think that's actually pretty reasonable to look at when we look at tools or the two tools, Spec and EasyBuild. So first of all, I'm not a system administrator, in no means. I also am not a Linux guru by any means. I'm in the larger field of HPC somewhat since 2011, first as a student, then as a PhD student. Now I'm actually since January as a postdoc, and I mainly work on performance measurement and program analysis tools. I actually attended a Spec tutorial at an ISC several years ago, and then never used it. So yeah, that's when I say I never had exposure to any of those tools. I actually attended a Spec tutorial at ISC. When looking at the audio and video setup, I mentioned that I actually started streaming on Twitch during the last year of my PhD, just to motivate myself to do stuff. And then I figured it would be cool to have a fixed time slot to try out stuff that's on my I want to try that out list. So that is actually where my exposure to both Spec and EasyBuild came from, in the sense that I have a regular thing now on Twitch that is called Tool Thursday, where I simply have 90 minutes per week to play around with something. And the first two tools on that list that I was going through are actually Spec and EasyBuild, because I had a large interest in both, because I also want to potentially package my software that I work on as a PhD student or now as a postdoc in one of both, or in one of either or both tools. And so I want to get familiar with the tools, and also how they can help me in my regular work with, like developing software on an HPC system or on my home machine. So that's somewhat where I come from, and basically how much exposure I had to both of these tools. So for Spec, it's about 4 episodes so far, totaling roughly 7 hours. And for EasyBuild, it's honestly, I think it's 3 episodes by now, so totaling 4 to 6.5 hours. I'm actually not sure. I have to look into my VOD archive. So if you're curious, it's Thursday night, 9:30 p.m. CET to 11 p.m. Sometimes midnight. And then during to Thursday, there needs to be some sort of goal that I want to achieve with the software. So in this sense, for Spec and EasyBuild, I want to familiarize myself a little bit with both tools. And our compute center just more recently decided to go with Spec. So, okay, that's just out there. For me, the goal is that I want to set up my development environment on my home machine, which is a Manjaro Linux. I think I'm the only person running EasyBuild on Manjaro Linux so far, with the Cinnamon DE. And currently, I actually use containers for development. And then so I first want to do that. I want to compile my software given the software stack that I created with Spec or EasyBuild. And then I want to create a package file for my software so that I could actually make it available on both, or at least one of those 2 tools. Now, which is the software that I'm going to use for that? It's called MetaCG. It's on GitHub. And I don't want to go into any detail here. There's my PhD defense on YouTube that you can check out if you're curious. And there will be a FOSDEM talk on February 6th in the HPC Dev Room, where I'm going to talk about a little more about the software itself. Here, the main things that are relevant, I would say, is that we have a couple of dependencies and specific versions that we want to use or need to use. So GCC 9 is more we want to use GCC 9 because of that's what we currently test with. We know it works, blah, blah, blah. We rely on Clang LLVM 10. So we actually build a Clang tool. And so we stick to the specific version 10 right now because of Clang not having a necessarily completely stable API. And then we have dependencies, OpenMPI, some JSON libraries, some cxxopts library, and we require score P and cube, or and the tool extra P. So that is our target, is to make MetaCG work in an environment that has been installed using Spec or EasyBuild. And let's start off with Spec. So I guess that's not something people are unfamiliar with, that Spec is a multi-platform package manager that builds and installs multiple versions and configurations of software. So that's a quote. And so my understanding is that I type install GCC and then Spec resolves dependencies and installs them if they are not already there. Just like if you type like apt-get on Ubuntu and you say apt-get Clang and you get everything you need to actually use Clang thereafter. All right, so let's just then do it. There is a README, it says git clone, and then cd and Spec install zlib. So I clone the repository. That worked well, okay. And then if you want to actually load something you installed with Spec, you source a script, okay, even better, right? And then the first build is I just install zlib, and it's exactly ./spec spec install zlib, and there we go. It downloads stuff. Didn't find any pre-built binary, so it's installing from source and compiling it, and there we have it. All right, that went nice and smooth and without any problems. So then let's move on to installing actually the MetaCG toolchain. The first thing that I hit was when I want to install OpenMPI, that Spec didn't realize that the system GCC can actually compile Fortran. Since I did not have the actual G-Fortran package installed. The error message that I received wasn't particularly clear. So I then said, all right, let's go to the next step already and just install GCC in version 9 from Spec. because that's the GCC version I want to have anyway, and I don't want to have GCC version 11, which is on Manjaro. And then with the spec install GCC, it actually has Fortran support. So I was also able to just compile OpenMPI. All the other dependencies are actually there. So that's awesome, except extra P. So extra P is something that is sort of developed in the Scalesca performance analysis area, and it does performance modeling using profiles. And then it also requires certain libraries. So here we just see spec install LLVM at version, and then for a specific compiler and install kubelib, which is a dependency of the extra P that you need also for the respective GCC version that I installed. The syntax was at first a little weird, I would say, because I was like, okay, so what does it mean? And if it gets more complicated, I'm actually like, I was scratching my head like, okay, so what's the ampersand again? And what's the hat? And what's all this doing? But I actually got used to it quite quickly. So that was cool. But now let's look at the extra P package. As I said, I did this live on Twitch. So there actually was a Twitch user that for whatever reason follows me, and for whatever reason tuned in. Apparently he has some experience with Spec, because he actually provided me with an extra P package file. And so here, shout out to Babumts, who is the Twitch user. I think the documentation of how to do this would have eventually gotten me there. But just being given the package file, I happily just received it. And this is actually the package that is potentially even contributed back to the Spec repository. I don't know what his plans are. But so this was actually the biggest obstacle that I faced when for installing all the dependencies for MetaCG. One of the particularities, which means that you cannot just depend on other stuff for the extra P, is another particularity of MetaCG, because we are actually requiring the headers of the extra P source code, which are regularly not installed. So you just install the bin and lib folders. So here we need to copy the include from the source tree to the install tree in order to make sure that we could actually compile MetaCG with the specific installation. So this is one actual addition that you need to do to the spec, to the general AutoTools toolchain command that's run by Spec in order to make that work. So now we have all the dependencies, and now we can simply compile MetaCG, right? Well, that's how fitting for this meeting is. MetaCG is actually deficient in its CMake configuration, so it's our fault. We assume certain things that aren't there. Specifically, we assume something of the cxxopts package that's from an older version. That's not the default, so to speak, that is installed by Spec. And so I wasn't able to just go ahead and compile MetaCG with all the stuff that I just recently installed. But that's not Spec's fault. That's our fault, so to speak. And so I need to revisit that at some point. And then at that time, I actually moved on to EasyBuild. So I just want to wrap up what my experience with Spec was in that little example so far. First, I weirdly, and I call that enjoy. So I was quite happy that I can simply check out the repository and have it installed. That's just something I kind of enjoyed, apparently. And what I really liked was that the documentation told me what I needed to start. So I wasn't getting like any additional information, what things could do, how I could configure it or anything. It was really just, oh, you can just like type install zlib. All right, this was great. And once I got over the syntax initially, I think it actually works out quite nicely. And I was able to recall certain things faster than I actually expected. And all the packages I needed just built fine on my Manjaro machine. So my takeaway here is just that for the limited use case that was my MetaCG part, I didn't encounter any really obstacles in using Spec. Spec find and Spec list seem to behave differently when giving partial names. That was something I was very confused with. So I think find is the one that looks in the remote part, and that does partial matching, and list doesn't when you look at the local installed packages. So I was like, okay, why do I don't have kubelib if I look for cube? So maybe I was just missing a flag here. Something that I was not so happy with is that Spec does not display what it will build, in the sense that, oh, these are all the dependencies that I'm going to install. Like if you type in apt-get and it's beyond a certain threshold, you simply are being told like, oh, I'm going to download 600 megabytes of stuff. Are you know, like, do you want to continue? And this is something I actually would have expected as a user. Now, I don't know how many versions of Perl I now have installed on my system. Just it seems that every package comes with a different version of Perl that it wants. So I think I have now 6 different Perl versions. And then once I got over the initial steps, I felt that there was so much documentation. I was kind of feeling lost, like where to look at. So if I just want to do a CMake package file, where to start? That was sort of what I wasn't too happy with, and what I mentioned. I think I would have gotten there eventually, but it would have been somewhat of a rocky road in the sense that I would need to read a bunch of stuff, basically. Now, let's look at the contender. Let's look at EasyBuild. So EasyBuild is a software build and installation framework that allows you to manage scientific software on high performance computing or HPC systems in an efficient way. So that is what the EasyBuild README says. Now, my understanding is that I have a list of packages that I can install with ease and configure for other versions when needed. So it's a little different from my understanding of Spec. And let's see how well it behaves with the use case I just outlined for the MetaCG part. So this one is actually installed using pip. And here's something specific to Manjaro and specific to that time, I guess. When I installed it, Manjaro was still shipping Python version 3.9. And for the next stream, when I wanted to use it, Manjaro actually updated Python to version 3.10. And obviously this all doesn't work well. And so I had to reinstall it for Python version 2.7. I think now there's support for Python version 3.10 as well in EasyBuild. Yeah, but I just reinstalled it for 2.7. And thanks for the help, Kenneth. He was actually on stream helping me out quite a bit for a couple of things. And then sometimes I confuse my machine with a cluster, just as I did here. And I thought I had lmod installed already. I apparently hadn't. However, the sanity checks worked out. But then an EB search matplotlib just failed with a somewhat obscure error message, if I remember correctly. And then so I simply needed to install lmod, and then these things also worked just fine. So I then went ahead and went for the let's install GCC version 9, and there is a version 9.3. So I installed it, and I initially forgot robot, which I have mixed feelings about. I like it that it doesn't just go ahead and install everything. But also just like I pretty much always forgot to give it robot. So yeah, as I said, my expectation from a user's point of view, from my user point of view, would be it will install like smaller dependencies without any questions. But if it's actually going to compile Qt, for example, it'll tell me and like, oh, do you really want to do this, right? Then something that I realized while I was doing this, that the EasyBuild documentation didn't help me from the get-go on how to install something. Like, okay, so you have this and that's a screenshot from the README here that I don't know if you can read it, but it says EB HPL 2.3 FOSS 2019 B blah, and I was like, where do I find these names? Like, how do I know this? What's the command to get the list of these things, right? I mean, that's something you can obviously find and figure out, but that was like the first, okay, how am I supposed to use this thing? And then yeah, exactly. But the actual GCC build went fine, so that was nice. So then just compile LLVM 10 with GCC 9.3, right? Well, it's missing a config with the right GCC version. So we can see we have LLVM version 9 with GCC 9, but that's not what we need. And then we have LLVM version 10 with GCC 8 and 10, which is also not what we need, right? And so, okay, sure. I'm sure we can change versions with this and just see how far we get. So then without any idea of how this works, because I don't necessarily read documentation, or at least not, I don't go through like pages of documentation before I try out stuff. I initially tried one of the LLVM 10 packages, or I don't know, packages, but just say like EasyBuild software name is LLVM 10 and Toolchain is GCC with the version. And then I actually had no success, and it told me that there is no toolchain template found. The available toolchains, and then there's list of stuff, and there's GCC in there. So I was like, okay, it has GCC. It doesn't find a template. I'm not sure what this is actually trying to tell me. All right. Anyway, then the Twitch chat again jumped in. So thanks, Tom, who is giving a talk, I think tomorrow. Hatem on Twitch. Anyway. He told me, oh, you should copy the EB file and then change versions. All right, so I copied the LLVM 10 GCC 10 EB file. I changed that to, I changed the version of the toolchain to 9.3.0, which is the GCC I have. However, that also did not succeed, but it actually ended in a missing OS dependency error, which now I know I should have ignored with ignore OS steps, because EasyBuild doesn't know of the Manjaro package system, basically. All right, and then one of the streams was over, and we continue next week. So this next week, basically, Kenneth again was on stream, and he said, "Oh, you should potentially try or try Toolchain." So here we went with try Toolchain GCC Core 930. And then we made some progress. We actually found that the LDAP version of Manjaro apparently is too new for the curl version that's required by the dependencies. So we had to give it a without LDAP flag. And then the compile went smoothly. But again, we had some issues compiling LLVM with this GCC version. And I also think it was a CMake error that we got. So we then said, okay, let's do it the other way around. So we try software version 10.0.1 with an available GCC config for LLVM. The same LDAP problem occurred, so we fixed that. And then we got somewhat obscure CMake errors where it actually said, oh, we have support for C++ 17, but you can't make std unique pointer, which is a C++ 11 feature. So we're like, it's a C++ 14 feature, sorry, make unique pointer. But we're like, what? I mean, this doesn't make necessarily too much sense. So maybe, or actually, that's a problem with the binutils version and the Manjaro system, which is kind of new or quite recent. So we then changed the binutils version dependency in CMake in the easy config, but that didn't lead to much success. And then we had actually 2 binutils version in the whole dependence tree, because some of the packages were relying on 2.34 and others on 2.36.1. So that wasn't actually solving the problem. And by that time, I actually stopped just because I had to prepare the slides for this talk, right? So this was the end of last Twitch stream. So we continue tomorrow night, looking at EasyBuild and the trying to get LLVM 10 with GCC 9.3 actually compiled. An LLVM 10 build with GCC 10 works smoothly. It just compiles whatever without any issues, right? So it's really just that I have this demand that I want to have GCC 9.3 as the compiler. And this is also the sort of obstacle that I came across. I want LLVM 10 built with GCC 9.3, and I felt as if I was working against the system somehow. Now, I don't know if I was actually working against EasyBuild or the combination of EasyBuild and my host system, right? Because I don't know of any cluster that actually runs Manjaro. So it might just be the problem here. And then the other obstacle I had was that the documentation feels like it was written for just someone else or for people who have a different approach to trying out something than me. So that's a screenshot from the EasyBuild documentation here. And if you look at the getting started, there's installing, requirements, dependencies, sources, configuring, but there's an introductory topics and to the left with all the different things. There's no bullet point like easy, just like how to install something. And I was like, okay, where do I start to look into the docs, right? Is it really, do I have to go through all this configuration first before I can do anything? Because I was also just from Spec, I was used to a very different usage. So my takeaway here is that the available configs build smoothly and without issues. I built 2 or 3 things. So GCC 9.3 is an available easy config, and the LLVM 10 with GCC 10 worked out nicely. If you leave these roads, I'm not completely sure. What I liked is that it doesn't go ahead and download everything if you don't give it -- robot. But as I said, I'm also kind of annoyed by me forgetting about the -- robot. So, and I can see a lot of value in these common tool chains that I found in the documentation, which actually inspired or pointed me to what I think I want to do in our CI stuff as well, basically defining sort of common tool chains and potentially even using EasyBuild or Spec to test these things in our CI. And finally, the documentation didn't help me a whole lot, but the Twitch chat did, which I guess translates also to the Slack if I had asked my questions there. So comparison, that's the final slide. Well, not the second but last. So in Spec, you would do clone git repository, then you would do Spec install GCC, and on the other hand, for EasyBuild, you install via pip and then do eb gcc 93 -- robot. It's basically a summary of what I said. So I feel better with the docs that Spec actually has, where it's really just, oh, if you just want to do something, here's how you do that. If you want to be more specific, we tell you later on. Whereas I feel that EasyBuild is more for like people who know a system pretty well or have to think about how can we have this on our system without destroying it. And then on Spec, I just got lost in the documentation later on. And for EasyBuild, I didn't get there so far because I wasn't able to compile the dependencies that I wanted to have. So my conclusion is that for my daily work, I would probably use Spec. So I just needed a recent CMake version for work. So I just went ahead and said Spec install CMake. For creating a user-facing software stack, I'm not too sure actually. Because I'm very much intrigued by these common tool chains, just so like that things are sort of guaranteed to work. So for me, to get back to the beginning of the talk, I would vote both. It just depends, right? But since a black and white yes or no answer was demanded, I say for my daily work, I would choose Spec over EasyBuild. And so for me, that's sort of the winner. And if you want to discuss this more, I'm very happy to do that. And also there's another ad. So come join me tomorrow evening for Tool Thursday live on Twitch. And with that, I'm very happy for discussion and chat and questions. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. If people, they can raise their hands in Zoom and we will ask, and you'll be able to ask your questions.
I have a question regarding the robot part. So you say you like it and you don't like it at the same time. That's that's interesting.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a middle ground where EasyBuild can tell you like, okay, you asked me to install this, but I also need to install these 10 other things, and please confirm? And should it always do that, or should there like be a threshold where it says for 1 or 2, fine, I'll just go ahead and do it. For let's say 5, I'll start asking, and if it's 100, yeah, you'll have to be very firm to confirm what you're doing, something like this, or?
Yeah, exactly. So that's a very good point. So if I've used Ubuntu for a whole bunch of years, and there, if you would go ahead and say apt-get install something, if it's only, I don't know, a couple of megabytes to download or whatnot, I don't know how they determine actually how they prompt you with a question. They just go ahead and do it. If it's going beyond something, they ask you like, oh, by the way, this is going to download 680 megs of something, and these are the packages that I'm going to install, and there might be a problem here and something there. Do you want to continue? And you have to type yes. That is something I actually enjoy, in the sense that I feel okay, like smaller changes that I would not care too much about, they're just going to do. However, if it's taking longer, then or if it's just consuming bandwidth or whatnot, they're going to tell me. And so I can then reconsider potentially saying like, oh, you know what? I don't want to install the whole 32-bit ecosystem that might be floating around on Ubuntu because of, you know, like an image viewer or something. And so that was, yeah, I think a middle ground where like the system would prompt you for larger things, but go ahead and install just one library would be the one that I would prefer. Obviously, I cannot speak for the whole world, but just for me. So that's what I would prefer.
Yeah, only doing it for larger installations, like you mentioned, Qt, that may be difficult unless we actively tag stuff, like knowing that it's going to take a while. What I could imagine could be a middle ground if you're installing something and there's 1 or 2 direct dependencies missing, that you just go ahead and do that. But if it goes deeper down and those dependencies also have stuff missing, at that point maybe it could at least ask you for confirmation.
Yeah, maybe that's a good point. Yeah.
Okay, I see other questions. I see other questions as well. So.
It's not really a question, it's more a remark. What we have seen on Lumi is not that different from the conclusions on your slide. In a sense, we have some healthy competition between me and some others using EasyBuild on Lumi, and then one colleague who's a big fan of Spec. And in the early days of Lumi, he definitely had things set up quicker. But when it comes to building a clean software stack, I have my EasyBuild software stack ready. He doesn't have a Spec stack ready. And I have only 1 version of Perl, not 6 in the stack.
Yeah, so the Perl thing was something I was actually, I had to laugh about. Actually, I also have, just for the couple of things that I installed with EasyBuild, I have, I think now 2 versions of Perl. But yeah, so exactly. I think that with the like getting something up and running, Spec shines. If it's more of a larger deployment, so to speak, I think EasyBuild has its very bright sides. Yeah, thank you for the comment.
And actually, another element of the competition we had, he installed CP2K with Spec, but probably didn't give all the right parameters. I did it with an easy config that I borrowed from CSCS and modified for the different versions of dependencies on our system, and the EasyBuild one was twice as fast. So you can build things quickly with Spec, but it's not always a guarantee that all the right options are chosen. While in the easy config, all the knowledge is already contained. You don't have to choose other parameters anymore that may deteriorate performance.
I would say you could probably find examples of that both ways, where something works better with Spec out of the box. And I don't think there's anything really critical or let's say core to the tools that makes it better than the other.
Well, the one thing is that in EasyBuild, the configuration is very, very clearly fixed.
Yes, and we tried.
I assume, I didn't check, but I assume that that Spec for CP2K also supports zlip XSMM, but that was not installed by default. And that makes a huge difference in performance on many CP2K benchmarks.
So the Spec installs are minimal by default, while the EasyBuild ones are fat by default, something like that.
Maybe, or maybe it's just that CP2K package which wasn't properly written with the proper defaults, but
yeah, I guess it's as Kenneth said, it's really, I mean, so the thing is, for me, if I just want to like, oh, I'm missing, for example, CMake, right? Or I'm missing Git in whatever version because it demands it. I may just install a version or a configuration of that to get it up and running, not like considering things like, oh, specific performance demands or parameters, or if it's just running on my machine locally, it might not even be an issue if it's like 10% slower or faster, right? If you're using it on a large machine with, you know, like GPFS, Lustre, whatever file system, and then there would be no support for that, or you're not having InfiniBand support for something, and you're actually just falling back to gig E or so, that, you know, that makes things bad, right? But it doesn't make that bad if it's just running on my machine. So I would say that is really dependent on the use case, what works well and what not.
okay.
And as I said, I can see bright sides of EasyBuild and the fixed configuration you just mentioned for actual deployments. And for my daily work, so to speak, where I'm not a sysadmin, I was very happy with just give me some CMake 3.22. I don't care if it's like well optimized or not.
Okay, Maxime also has a question.
Hi. Yes, I was wondering, and I don't know if you have the answer or somebody else in the room does. I was wondering if it's only a fluke that LLVM with a specific version worked with GCC with another specific version with Spack and not EasyBuild. I'm thinking it must be a fluke because we routinely switch toolchain versions for many other dependencies and it just works. So, and
yeah. So we were discussing this actually on stream, and it's not completely clear where the issue actually comes from. So one of the, and this is why I always mentioned the host system as well. So this is, as I said, a Manjaro, which is kind of recent, and there was a somewhat older bin utils dependency in the CMake for GCC 9.3 and then also LLVM, which may be not the best choice for the system that I'm currently running. And so there might be some issues that arrive from there. Just compiling LLVM with version GC or compiling LLVM 10 with GCC 9 in general isn't an issue. That works quite nicely. So we did that a bunch of times. But so I would actually imagine that how these tool chains then fit together in the EasyBuild world, or, you know, like, or even, or they don't, right? That might be the issue here. But I don't know, maybe Kenneth has a better explanation. He was on stream a couple of times, so.
And I think what it boils down to is indeed an older bin utils on a system with very recent glibc, and there's a clash there. And that's sort of a result of you needing an older GCC version, GCC 9, where we basically stick to a single binutils for the particular GCC version. So whatever was the latest binutils back then, when we defined that GCC toolchain is the one we stick with. And it's not the first time that going forward, going to recent operating systems, we see issues with that all of a sudden. So that's not a total surprise. And yeah, I guess it's just because of your use case of installing on a very recent OS.
Yeah. So this is something I actually want to do in potentially not tomorrow, but at some point. I want to go through the whole example, basically the whole use case on our cluster, which is now Red Hat 8 and was CentOS 8 before, just to see how things change when I use that there, right? Because I would consider Red Hat 8 a much more HPC OS than Manjaro rolling release.
Yeah, and I don't think there was anyone in the EasyBuild user survey mentioning Manjaro.
Well, there was one.
Well, you maybe, yes. except for you, yeah. Yeah, so that's basically what it boils down to. And I guess you're just not hitting that issue with Spack, because with Spack, it's just, okay, I need binutils, I'll just install latest, and then it never sees that issue.
Yeah.
Okay. There was
the Spack LLVM package has a whole bunch of work that's gone into matching the binutils version for the LLVM version, because when people build that, I mean, that's a huge common problem. If you only really support one version of, I don't know, LLVM per toolchain, you probably don't run into that. But if you're trying to if everyone's trying to install a different one, like devs do, yeah, that work pays off.
Okay, thank you for that comment.
Do we have other questions? I'm not paying close attention to Slack, but maybe Simon is. You also mentioned the documentation. Maybe can you go back to your comparison slide? Yeah, this one. Yeah, so Spec seems to be doing a bit better, at least initially. And we have plans as well to redo our documentation, essentially moving to a different format and tools, and probably, yeah, trying to do a better job. This thing has grown organically over the years, and I don't think we've ever really done a major effort in trying to make sure that it makes sense, especially to new people. So maybe that we can do that along with the work of moving it to Markdown and MKDocs. So that's definitely very good feedback.
Yeah.
So do you think like the landing page should be getting started with EasyBuild? So installation, configuration, and install me one thing, and then let me go on from there?
Yeah, well, I think it depends a little bit on who you target with EasyBuild, actually. That's what, so I kind of refer to documentation where you're getting explained a whole bunch of things that what you can do with a software or could do with it, sort of like the Linux or open source software documentation, where people are intrigued by what you can do with it, and then they tell you about it. Instead of just saying, oh, if you just want to do the most basic use case, you just have to type this, right? And this is what I feel Spec does a pretty good job with. If I just want to install something, I just say Spec install something, and that's the first bullet point of the documentation, basically. And that it then goes along and tells me like, oh, the requirements, prerequisites, configs, compiler setup, blah blah blah. But it's like, if I just want to get started, so I'm impatient, right? I just want to like install and git clone and install something. I want to see if it goes right off the box, right? I don't know if that's a valid assumption or use case for EasyBuild in general, just from like, if it's more targeting, let's say, larger deployments. And so I guess the documentation can be a little more or less verbose in the beginning. I don't know if you can, if it makes sense to boil it down to as little as you have with Spec, for example, in that regard.
Did you only look at the documentation or also the tutorial?
In both cases, I only looked at the documentation.
Okay. because I think that the tutorial already has a different focus a bit. Maybe it's still too wordy though, if you're just really new and you want to get started quickly and make it do something semi-useful and then dive in deeper a bit later. So that's definitely good feedback.
And obviously that's just my opinion, right, and my perception of these things. I know that I have colleagues who first read the documentation and then do something, or I mean, they not necessarily read all of it, but they read a good chunk of it and then do something. Where I usually also just, if there is documentation, I just go from top to bottom on like the first couple of examples. But then, as I mentioned earlier, then you have this HPL with stuff, and this is like, oh, where do all these things come from, right? So how do I find these things? What does it mean actually? So I think boiling it down somewhat helps, and then have these little explanations for people who are just new to how this looks, basically, right?
Yeah, you could have a very basic starting page where it just says to install EasyBuild, do this, and then have a link for other options on installing EasyBuild, check here, and then so you can gradually deep dive into stuff that you really care about. So the basic configuration, just copy paste this line. If you want to know more, go there. So something like this could be a better landing page. And I mean, you say it depends on the use case as well. That's very true. But based on the survey, we know that 20% of the current community, if we can extrapolate the survey to the full community, started using EasyBuild in the last year. So documentation for people who are new to the tool is still very, very relevant, and that's something we need to be aware of. What's currently there is just way too overwhelming. You get a long list of stuff it can do, and you don't really know. Just tell me the basics. Let me get started.
We've had people ask for like a more how-to oriented set of docs. Like we have the tutorial, which is kind of like that, but it's really for sort of intro stuff. And then we have the docs, which are part reference, like in some sort of sprawling contributed things that people have added. And I think really like what users seem like they want is like a breakdown of the use cases and some high level sort of walkthroughs for those workflows up front. And we haven't had time to put that together because it actually takes a lot of work to do that well. So, and it's like 3 kinds of docs then, and because you still want the reference, and you still want the intro, and then you also want these sort of detailed, like almost like in-depth blog post like walkthroughs too. But I mean, sort of like what the Lumi guys are saying about how they have all of their preferences encoded in easy configs. Like with Spec, you can do that in an environment. The packages are, think of Spec as like EasyBuild with more of a focus on the easy blogs. We don't have a tutorial that really shows you how to set up a system stack with Spack, and sites do it slightly differently. I really would like to do a survey of how they do that and show how to set up like a Spack environment with CI for site deployment, because obviously like we're not doing that well right now. So better docs is probably our biggest request from the most recent survey too.
And I just want to add to that. I don't feel that just looking at my own software, I'm in any like position to demand better documentation. Just from I don't know if I don't think those are the worst documentation that's out there on the internet, but it's certainly on the worst side of things. But from most of my colleagues who are, again, mostly software developers or research folks, getting something just up and running in like in an easy way without like, I don't care about how the system is actually set up, or I don't have to maintain this for long, or I don't plan to like have a user facing part. It's really just for me because I need to install something, and I don't want to go through the auto tools. I don't want to go through the different like wgets to download a bunch of stuff. I just want to have CMake 3.22, and my Compute Center doesn't provide it for me. I can't install it using apt-get. So I just say spec install cmake 322, right? So that's sort of the use cases that I see in our group for most of the time.
Yeah, and I feel like we should do a talk like this again, but then find a sysadmin or a user support person to make the comparison. And I would say that the result will be slightly different, or at least the pain points that are raised are probably going to be very different. So.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe to wrap up, because we have to get ready for the next talk. Actually, a question for Todd. And is there anything you learned new here in this comparison that you think you could improve in Spec?
Yeah, I mean, sure. Like all the things that he ran into that were problems. We've had people complain about the people have hit the system compiler thing for a while, where like you've got GCC and G++ installed, but not G4tran, and we give you an unhelpful error message for the Fortran compiler. We should probably just suck it up and fix that. Although we're completely redoing how compilers work in Spec soon, so I think that'll fix it. I don't know. Yeah, I guess I learned from the Lumi guys that we need to better document how to set up a stacking environment with settings. I mean, because it is true that like you can stick your easy configs in a repo, and it is all laid out for you in verbose detail. Yeah, I think we could probably improve Spec environments to do more of that. But that having a consistent stack, seems like what the user support folks want.
The user support folks mostly want less tickets.
Yeah, sure.
That's really the main goal of whatever they do, less tickets. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Once again, I just want to mention that thank you for having me and for the idea of having this talk. I enjoyed that.
Yeah, I think it's a good experiment, and
that was a great talk.
Getting a fresh view on these tools is very valuable, because for us, we're just totally blind for some of these things, because we're playing with this every day. So thanks a lot, JP.
Yeah, thanks for having me.